Status update, where we are now. I want to talk about the differences that we think exist between the ISO 20022 standard as we found it and the ISO 20022 standard for inclusive instant payment systems. And this will be an interactive session, so those of you who want to cause trouble are most welcome to do so. Then I'm going to talk about messages and APIs. I'm going to talk about a market practice document and where we are on that. And finally, I'm going to talk about an African or possibly global ISO 20022 initiative for instant. So, moving right along. Status update. We've been a member of the ISO 20022 organization for the past 3 years. Bit of background, we looked originally at ISO 20022 when we first started around about 2013 to 14. We formed the conclusion that it was not well adapted for what we wanted to do in terms of an instant payment system, and we therefore passed by on the other side. However, it happened that the world generally decided that ISO 20022 was a good thing, so not being inflexible in any way, we reconsidered and we decided that the sensible plan was to join the ISO 20022 organization and, if we could, to turn the ISO 20022 standard into something which was much more like what we thought it needed to be. So we've been a member since 2022, oh sorry, 2022, I should say. We're represented on the registration management group, which is the top level group on the ISO 20022 organization. We're members of the payment standards evaluation group. We belong to the technical support group, and we also belong to the API support group, which is a specialist subgroup of the technical support group dealing particularly with APIs and ISO. Now, very few people, I think, pick up the ISO 20022 standard and say to themselves, this is exactly what I want. Maybe there are such people in the world, but I have to say, I've never met one. So there are different ways in which you can turn the overall standard into what you want. First of all, you can say, this standard has got everything I want and an awful lot more besides, so I'm going to take some of it out because I don't need it for my purposes. And that is generally done by what's called a market practice document. I'll be talking a bit more about that in the near future. Alternatively, you can change the standard itself. Now, I have to say that this is not a quick process. The ISO 20022 organization works on 1-year cycles, and even getting onto a 1-year cycle is not easy. So it's, how can I put this? High maintenance, but in the end, it should get you what you want. You can also add what's called supplementary data to a message. Now, every ISO 20022, well, it's not completely true. Most ISO 20022 messages have a bit in the definition at the bottom, which is called supplementary data. And organizations can use that subject to registering what they're going to do with it with the ISO 20022 organization to do specialized things if they need to. Finally, you can slash and burn. Now, I know that how can I put this? The rigorous engineering principles of the people in this room would never allow them to pick up an ISO 20022 schema definition and say, I don't like that, I'm going to get rid of it, I'm going to add a bit in here because I want that, etc., and wind up with something which is kind of, well, how can I put this? A proud granny might say, oh, doesn't it look like the ISO 20022 standard? But it doesn't. So we took the view that the sensible way of doing this was to change the standard. Change the standard so that it included the things that we needed it to contain. The worst of all of these is the slash and burn approach, because that winds up with something which you can use. And you can even call it an ISO 20022, but it's not, because as you will soon find, if you try to send a message that conforms with your standard to any other organization that consumes ISO 20022 messages. So we took the view that we needed to change the standard. What did we need to do we think? Well, the things that we really thought were missing that were fundamentally important were, first of all, an agreement of terms phase. Now, what Mojaloop does, those of you who've investigated Mojaloop will know this already, is before you can execute a payment, you have to get agreement from the bank or the DFSP, which is going to credit the customer that says, I agree with this payment, and if you send it to me within a given amount of time, I promise that I will execute it if I possibly can. Now, one reason why we do that is to be as sure as we possibly can that we won't start moving funds until we're confident that a payment will succeed. One of the things that the payment systems spend the most time, effort, and money on is sorting payments out when they've started to move funds and then the payment has not succeeded. What we try to do, we can't stop people making mistakes, sending funds to the wrong person, sending funds to accounts that can't receive them, those sorts of things. But what we can do is make sure that all of those mistakes get shaken out before we actually come to move the funds, before customers get funds reserved in their accounts, before DFSPs are required to provide liquidity cover, all of that kind of thing. So that's a fundamentally important part of it. It's also a fundamentally important part when you start to look at the requirements for compliance in FATF recommendation 16. Because one of the things that an agreement of terms allows you to do is it allows both parties to exchange information about their customers. So instead of just saying, well, I'm going to send that money and I don't know whether it's going to succeed, it might not because the recipient might be a terrorist or a general undesirable. We get that information in advance and we can decide not to send the money because the DFSP whose customer account that holds is going to say, sorry, this guy is a terrorist, you can't send funds to his account. Second, we want deterministic outcomes for payments. Now again, in the normal ISO 20022 structures, you throw a payment over the fence and then you think, I wonder what happened to that. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, sometimes it works immediately, sometimes it takes 2 days, sometimes it takes 5 days, sometimes it takes a week. You've got no real way of telling. So what we do is we say, when you send a payment, you send with it a message saying, if you can't complete this payment in X, which might be 5 minutes or a minute or 10 minutes or however long you like, please cancel it and tell me. And that means that we don't wind up with large numbers of payments in the system whose status is uncertain, where we don't know whether they are going to succeed or not. And that's another fruitful cause of disputes and expensive resolutions. If one side of the payment thinks, oh, okay, that's succeeded, so I will debit my customer, and the other side doesn't credit the beneficiary, eventually the beneficiary is going to say, hey, what happened to my money? And then there's all kinds of trouble and aggravation. We also, ISO 20022 messages don't in themselves have what we call non-repudiation. Now, when we set the original Mojaloop standard up, it said every message will have a signature so that the person who gets the message can verify first that the message really was sent by the institution that said they sent it, and second, that it wasn't modified by anybody else in transit. So that means that if there's ever any dispute, the person who received the message can say, you sent me this message. I know this because I checked the non-repudiation signature. And then there's no argument. So that's a matter of fundamental importance for us. Now, we have also added, we have added to the payment execution status messages cryptographic locks to the two standard payment execution messages, PAX 008, PAX 009, message geeks, and keys, PAX 002. We use a lock and key, cryptographic lock and key mechanism, first of all, to lock the terms of the payment, and then when the payment is completed by the receiving institution, it sends back the key, and the key means that everybody can verify that it was the payee institution said, yes, this key unlocks lock that you originally said. We've added expiry times as well. And these, I'm happy to say, have now been included in the most recent release of the published ISO 20022 data dictionary. Hey, yeah, and they said it couldn't happen. Absolutely. So that was great. It only took us 3 years. Well, second part of this is the agreement of terms. Now, we're currently working on new messages to cover the agreements of terms phase. We originally thought that we would have different statuses for the PAX 008 and the PAX 009, the payment executions. But the evaluation team who looked at this said they didn't think that was a good idea because basically everybody who got a PAX 008 would think it was an instruction to execute a payment. And therefore it would be better to have different messages to cover the agreement of terms. And we always do what we're told. So we did. Now we have, I'm not really sure where I should point this to get good results. Clearly not any of the places I'm pointing it at the moment. Oh, there we are. So first of all, I want you to share my pain in this bit. First of all, you have to produce a business justification for the agreement of terms. We did this, it's been approved. Second of all, we have to extend the data model to include the proposed new messages, and we've done that. Third of all, we have to revise the message definition report, which is the published document that goes with every ISO 20022 set of messages to say what they're for and how they're used. We've produced one. We had an initial review. I have to say the results were disappointing. I'm glad that my A-level result paper was not like that. So we are revising them and we will be submitting them, I hope, in time for the next payment seg meeting. I just want to talk a little bit about how we do currency conversion, because that's another area where ISO 20022 doesn't currently have any message support. Now, it has things that enable you, if you're a large-scale foreign exchange trader, to do netting off and settlement of obligations for foreign exchange. But what it doesn't have is what we need, which is something for individual retail payments. So we treat it, and I'm happy to report that Julie Guetta, who is in the room as we speak, was the originator of this rather excellent suggestion, was that we should treat it as a request for cover, which is a PAX 009 message. Because effectively what's happening is that the sending institution, the debtor institution, is saying to the currency converter, please give me the target currency funds that I need in order to make the payment that I want to make. Now that includes a link to the main payment, and that means that we can do payment versus payment integrity. So we do a currency conversion, and when we execute the currency conversion, we are effectively saying to the currency converter, to the foreign exchange provider, you'll get your money, but only if the payment succeeds. If the payment fails, no dice. Okay? Now, I want to get on and talk about how we map ISO 20022 messages onto our API. I'm going to be talking about APIs in more detail in a moment, but for the moment, I just want to let you know what our mapping is for our endpoints onto ISO 20022 messages. So we've got a payer DFSP on one side, a payee DFSP on the other side, and a foreign exchange provider in the middle doing the currency conversion. We have, as people will say, ad nauseam, 3 phases: discovery, agreement, and transfers. And as you see, there's an agreement and a transfer with the foreign exchange provider as well. So what do these messages look like? Well, the initial request for discovery, get parties request, doesn't have a payload, because all you're saying is, I want to find out who owns this identifier, the message ACMT 024, which is not coincidentally the same message that Project Nexus uses for that response. Then for the agreement of terms, for currency conversion, we have a new message, PAX 091. That's our candidate name for it. And down at the bottom, you'll see we have a response, which is a PAX 092. So these are new messages that we are currently modeling for inclusion in the standard. Then the post quotes, which is a request for agreement of terms itself for the payment, is again a new message, PAX 081. And the response, again, is a new response, PAX 082. Finally, FX transfers is a PAX 009 request and a PAX 002 response. These are standard messages with the changes that I talked about. And for transfers themselves, that's a PAX 008, and the response is a PAX 002. So that's the complete set, mapping ISO 20022 messages onto the endpoints, the resources that we use to define and execute a payment. Okay. Oh, sorry. We've also got patches on transfers and FX transfers. And we use a patch. In some cases, well, sorry, for a transfer itself, there are some cases where a DFSP is actually handing out cash, for instance, at an ATM, or where a shopkeeper is actually handing out goods, let's say in a shop. If something goes wrong, like a timeout, then they've just lost that money because the customer has walked away with cash in their hand or a basket full of shopping. So we allow DFSPs to say, I approve this transfer, please notify me when you have confirmed it. And that enables them to wait until the switch has confirmed it irrevocably before they clear the funds to the customer. The same is true with foreign exchange. When the payment completes, then the foreign exchange provider gets a message saying, payment is completed, you can go ahead and you will get your funds for the currency conversion. Okay, so that is the set of messages or set of resources that comprise the way in which we map ISO 20022 messages onto Mojaloop resources for payments. Does anyone have any questions on that?
Yes, hello. Can you just repeat again the scenario just now you mentioned about timeout?
Okay.
So how is that what PAX 02 does to
Yes, it is. So what will happen is, if, let's suppose the payee DFSP is operating an ATM, the customer's standing there. It will send back a put transfers saying, I approve the transfer, but that put will have a special status. At the moment, it's reserved. And that says to the switch, if you're going to time this out, or if you're going to approve it, let me know, and I will not clear the funds to my customer until I receive notification from you. And the notification that the payee DFSP receives from the switch is done via a patch, which is update the status of a document. That makes sense?
Yep.
Good.
Understand. Thank you.
Any other questions, comments? Pretty happy? Good. You have, oh, sorry, there is another question.
Just one question on API itself,
Mhm.
because most API now run on JSON,
Sorry?
JSON language, which is actually a much shorter version of payments message.
I
Right?
am going to get on to that.
Yeah. All right. Good.
Yes, okay. We are, you see. This is my next section, messages and APIs. So, XML schemas are the things that I think everybody who's worked with ISO 20022 recognizes. They are XML definitions of what the content of a message should be, what it's allowed to have, how many of each, all of that kind of stuff. But it's not the only way in which ISO 20022 messages can exist. There are, in fact, an implementation of an underlying data dictionary definition. And for instance, if you go to the ISO 20022 site, you can go and look at the data dictionary, which is notionally at least an agnostic representation. So it shouldn't be XML specific. Now, in fact, you can see pretty clearly that XML was in their minds, but at least notionally, it's a transport agnostic version of the message definitions. There's going to be a JSON implementation, or sorry, a JSON schema implementation soon. Now, one of the things that the technical support group that I'm on has been working on quite hard over the last 18 months to 2 years is a definition of how to produce a JSON schema from a data dictionary definition. So that should mean, and I'm sure will mean because of the high technical caliber of the people who've been working on it, that you should be able to produce a JSON version of any message in the ISO 20022 data dictionary. Is that all we need? Well, not quite, as usual, is the answer. Because an API adds what I would call a verbal structure to the message. It adds an HTTP command, get, put, post, whatever it might be, and the name of the resource which a command should act on. Now, you remember we looked at post transfers, put transfers, post quotes, put quotes, all of those kinds of, the quotes, the transfers, those are the names of the resources in the bizarre conceptual world of HTML. They're documents. So a post is an instruction that says, create a document with these characteristics. A get is an instruction that said, get the document, give me the document with these characteristics, those sorts of things. So each schema represents the information which can be sent or received via the verbal structure of the API. And an API definition, generally speaking, we call that a schema, and that will contain all of the endpoints with all of the resources that the API supports. And for each of those, all of the content that you are allowed to put in. So effectively, a JSON version of an ISO 20022 message will appear as what is actually quite a small part of the overall API definition. The other point that's worth making about this is that generally speaking, there is no necessary structure of an API that says you need to include what ISO 20022 message you think this is. So you're including the structure of the message, but there's nothing. So, for instance, with an XML message, you will normally expect something in the header information of the message that says, this is a PAX 008. And not only that, it's a PAX 008 of this version. And therefore, anybody who wants to check whether it's a valid message or not should be able to do so by getting the ISO 20022 schema, which says, here's how to construct a message. Sorry, I'll rephrase that. Here's how to construct that particular message. Now, it's not necessarily the case with an API element that that is the case. There is nothing you have to have in an API element which says the content of this resource should be a PAX 008 or a PAX 002 or whatever else it might be. So that's something, I mean, in some ways, this is very nice for us because you'll be amazed to hear that the messages that define the agreement of terms for a PAX 008, for instance, a payment execution message, they say the proposal for terms and the response that says, yes, these are the agreed terms, you will be amazed to hear, as I say, that the structure of those messages is pretty much exactly the same as the structure of a PAX 008 message. It's just got something on the top of it which says, this is a PAX 081 or a PAX 082 or a PAX 091 or a PAX 092. With an API endpoint, that's not necessarily the case. So if it were the case, for instance, that there were a delay in the implementation of those messages, we could just stick a load of PAX 008s in and nobody would ever know the difference. Which is kind of nice, really. Anyway, sorry. So each schema is attached to a command and resource combination, get parties, post quotes, those sorts of things. So as I say, that can mean that the same message structure has a different semantic meaning depending on the endpoint it's attached to. So a post quotes and a post transfers will have the same structure pretty much. You can tell that one is, let's say, should be a PAX 008 and the other should be a PAX 081 because of the endpoints they're attached to. But there's nothing in the content of the API definition that tells you that has to be the case. Okay, does anyone have any questions on that side of things? The API and messages side of things? You mean header information? I love this audience. Every time they ask a question, they say, tell me about the thing you're going to talk about next. Mind you, I'm going to have to hand out lots of fivers. Sorry, does anyone have any questions on the API? One thing that is worth saying is that there are systems in the world, RAST in Pakistan is one of them, which actually just put the ISO 20022 XML message as a blob inside their API. So effectively, you just get something which is an unstructured, as far as the API definition is concerned, it's unstructured information. You take the content of that, and that is an XML message. We did consider that, but we think it's probably long-term. It's not a very good way of doing things. However, that does open up the question, what happens in a world where some systems use messages and other systems use APIs? And in particular, if you want to do things like non-repudiation signatures and those kinds of things which are dependent on content. However, we have a kind of answer for that, which I may talk about if I have time. Now, I can tell Sam is all agog to find out about headers. Those of you who don't know, probably all of you do. The HTTP messages have what are called headers, which contain information about the message. Information about how to route it, information about what the content is like in terms of structure, those kinds of things. In our existing world, there are really two types. First of all, there are standard header fields defined by by the World Wide Web Consortium. And they are things like what kind of material is contained in this message. Second type is Mojaloop specific fields, and they are fields that we have invented because they contain information that we need them to have, but which aren't available via the standard World Wide Web Consortium fields. Now, in the ISO 20022 world, there is a different definition for what's called a business application header. And that is designed to provide a standard way for information about a message to be conveyed along with the message and independently of the transport method. Goodness me, I hear you say. That sounds quite a lot like an HTTP header. And indeed, the SWIFT standard for cross-border messages uses business application headers. So what that means, it also has a standard container, which is called a business message envelope. So effectively that says, here is an envelope which contains a business application header and whatever the message body is. There's an example for those of you who really like to read HTML. That's an example from the Swift CBPR messages, and you can see, here's where I found out where I can, you can see at the top, the first element is an envelope, which is effectively the message envelope, which contains everything. Then you get a head, defined as an app header. Down to the bottom, you can see there is a head comes to an end, and then you get a PAX document. And that says in the content of that element, what kind of a PAX document that is, in this case, a PAX 008. Then the standard PAX 008 fields appear below that. And at the bottom, you will find that the envelope is closed. So that provides a standard way of including header information with a message. Now, there we go. Let me talk about the Mojaloop specific header fields. So we have the source, they all start with FSP-IOP. There's the source, which is the DFSP who originally sent the message. The destination, which amazingly enough, is the DFSP to whom the message is addressed. We've got encrypted fields of an API message if we are using encryption. We don't currently, but we have ways of doing that. So if people need to encrypt parts of a message, they can do that. There is the signature of the message, which is the signature, the non-repudiation signature, which was generated by the institution that sent the message. The URI of the message and the HTTP method of the message. And they are included so that you can verify that the message you're getting in terms of the HTTP verb and the resource is the same as the one that the originator sent. So our proposal is that messages which are exchanged via an API should make use of a business application header. And that should contain all of the Mojaloop specific fields, the ones that I've just been talking about, which are currently defined for the HTTP header. General fields, we think, should remain in the HTTP header. I think that was probably going to say except for the algorithm field, which is a World Wide Web Consortium field that says which algorithm was used to construct the signature. We probably think that that should be in the business application header as well. So that will mean that we can basically say, in the same way as Swift does, if you want to send a message to a Mojaloop system, it should have a business application header attached. And that will mean that the routing information that we currently have in our HTTP headers will move into the business application header and will make it easier for us to convert back and forth between messages and API calls. Any questions on that side of things? Okay. So, market practice document. This explains how a given scheme implements ISO 20022 messages. So it says things like, if you want to if you want to emit a message that can be processed by this scheme, you are not allowed to include these fields, even though the schema says you can. You must include these fields, even though the schema says they're optional. You can't make mandatory fields optional using this, using a market practice document. And obviously you can't add new fields in the market practice document. But basically it's a specialization of how that's used, how the overall specification is used. Now this is registered with ISO 20022, but it doesn't require their approval. You're just saying, I'm going to use them in this way. I'm going to tell you because I'm a nice, polite person, but essentially it's none of your business. We will produce a Mojaloop market practice document, and that will be something which essentially contains our view in general of the relationship between an inclusive instant payment system like Mojaloop and the ISO 20022 specifications. Let me take an example. The ISO 20022 specification says you're allowed to include all kinds of intermediary agents in a message. Mojaloop does not understand, I'm sad to say, the concept of intermediary agents. If you send something to a Mojaloop system saying, I want this guy to process it, then that guy to process it, then that guy to process it, then that guy to process it, which you can perfectly regularly do in an ISO 20022 message, Mojaloop will say, pardon me, I have no idea what you're talking about. Mojaloop has a standard way of routing messages, and it doesn't include intermediaries, broadly speaking. So our market practice document for inclusive payment systems will say, you can't use any of those intermediary agents. If you try to do so, that message will be rejected. And we've got a tool that enables us really graphically to look at the representation of a ISO 20022 schema and just simply punch out things that we don't want and produce an API definition based on that. So we have an initial release that we've been working on for the COMESA implementation, the one that you saw demonstrated this morning. We're going to review that. In fact, we are reviewing it at the moment. And we will generalize it to a Mojaloop version. Now, as I say, the team who are implementing the COMESA system, the DRPP system, have their own needs and their own ways of doing things. That won't necessarily be the way in which every Mojaloop system will want to work. So we will be producing, as I say, a generalized version, which we will expect people who are implementing Mojaloop ISO 20022 systems to specialize in whatever way seems appropriate to them. And obviously, we will be happy to lend support to people who are producing their own versions to make sure that they get things done in the way they need to get. Any questions on that side of things? On the market practice document? No? Okay. Now, I wanted to finish up with thinking in slightly broader terms. ISO 20022 standards are becoming increasingly common in payment systems on the continent. And it's not just, it's happening across the world. eventually the payment systems which use these standards will start to connect with each other. And the earlier we do something about it, the quicker and simpler those connections are going to be. What could we do now to help us meet those objectives? Which are, I think, payment instruction issued by a financial institution in any jurisdiction should be comprehensible to a processing financial institution in any other jurisdiction. Now, notice that I say comprehensible. It may very well be that there are all sorts of regulations that mean that you can't issue a payment instruction in Malawi to be executed in Peru. But the point is that if an institution in Malawi sends to an institution in Peru, the institution in Peru should be able to understand what it's got and decide whether or not to accept it. So that's the real objective that we have. Subject to, must have a way of settling, of course, must have agreement on regulations, must have all of those kinds of things. African ENDA have agreed to sponsor this initiative, at least for Africa. Now, I'm treading on slightly thin ice here because I had hoped that Robert Ochola from African ENDA would be here today. In fact, he's not here till tomorrow. We've had this discussion, but I didn't say to him, Robert, I'm going to commit you to something in my presentation. Is that okay? So I'm going to ask you, if Robert comes up and says, did Mike make me do something? You're all going to say, certainly not. Thank you. Drinks are on me. So what are the obstacles to integration? Well, semantic mismatches between payment systems. Different payment systems use different fields in the ISO 20022 specification to mean different things. This is a big temptation with ISO 20022. You just think, oh, well, that field, whatever it might be, has got enough space for what I want to do, so I'll just stick it in there, which means that that field now has a semantic meaning, which is particular to you, which is not the way that everybody else will necessarily understand it. We need to try as far as possible to make sure that we get rid of those semantic mismatches, or at least understand where they might be likely to occur. We want also to sort out syntactic mismatches between messages. Thank you very much. We need to look at different forms of message specialization. Now, it's very common, for instance, if you look at something like European TIPS, their instant payment system, that has a couple of 100-page manual that says, these are the rules you must follow if you want to produce a message that can be paid via TIPS. And it may be, but as we've said, different systems will have mutually exclusive ways of processing messages. But again, this is something that we need to sort out between systems. And if we can sort it out in advance and decide which of these things really are differences and which of them are just different ways of representing the same thing, then we're going to have a much better chance of arriving at eventual continental or perhaps global interoperability. And also there will be differences in market practices. Some jurisdictions will say, I'm going to allow this, but not that. Others will say, I'm going to allow that, but not this. And again, we're not saying we are trying to construct a message that can be used by every system. What we're trying to do is identify ways in which systems are really different from each other and make sure that the differences are not about things where they're really the same as each other. How can we avoid them? Well, first of all, by having discussions at the model level, not about the individual content. We need to understand for each system what it is that that system wants to do before we understand how it's going to do it. If we understand what the different systems are going to do, independently of how they do it, then we have a better chance of winding up with message definitions which can be interoperable between those systems. We need all of us to be open to alternatives, to be able to look at the way in which we think we're going to do things and say, well, okay, maybe that's not the best way of doing things, or maybe it is the best way of doing things, but because everybody else does it a different way, we might do things that way. And then finally, we need to insist that everybody adheres to the standard, that if we decide we need changes, then those changes are made to the standard and not by slashing and burning or putting in bits of additional information that not everybody will understand. So that's really just looking at what we need to do next, which is, so first of all, establish a forum and a cadence so that we can at least converse with each other regularly about these things. Some kind of definition of the taxonomy structure of a payment, and something which starts mapping ISO 20022 messages onto that taxonomy. I've just done a quick example of what a payment taxonomy might look like there. So, one of the things that I hope is that those of you who are interested in this will contact me over the course of this convening. And when Robert turns up tomorrow, we can present him with a united front of enthusiastic people saying, Robert, lead us to the promised land. And that's all I have to say about ISO 20022 and messaging standards. Does anyone have any questions?
Yes. Hi.
Hello.
I'm Faris. We're from Payment Network Malaysia.
Mhm.
Just trying to give some context before I address my question.
Sure.
Before I give my question. So for Payment Network Malaysia, we actually have established 11 different corridors for cross-border payments. Means to say that not only we enable the banks and digital wallet in Malaysia to transact with each other, whoever is on our rail can also transact with people from Singapore, Thailand, and vice versa. They can also transact with us. So one of the key things that we actually found in the obstacle side of things is before we even touch about the content of the message specification, in which actually different country that we connected to so far focuses more on reducing the amount of information that they request. Means to say that, for example, Alipay Plus only asks you about 4 things in the account inquiry flow and things like that. So it's very lean. But before we even touch upon the message specification, the account, the overall transaction flow and the payment orchestration is very different to what is shown here. Granted, some of it is because it's a different use case. I'm talking about pay to merchant. But largely, even for P2P, we only have 2 transaction flow. The first one is account inquiry.
Yep.
And the second one is credit transfer, and that's it. So how would you address if the intention is to go not only, between the nations in Africa,
Yep.
but also to look into the global side? In Asia, not just Southeast Asia, we only have 2 flows. So how do you address that?
How would I address that? Yes.
Yeah.
So one answer to that is this is not a new problem in the sense that we have the same problem in Africa. And we see this problem when we start to connect DFSPs to a Mojaloop system. The DFSPs very frequently say to us, we only have a 2-stage payment. You find out who you're going to pay and then you pay them. And we say, well, I'm sorry, one way in which you can deal with that is to automate a more complicated structure. And that's the way in which we've done it. So effectively, the customer only sees something that says, please, who should I pay? Is it me? Or is it Sam, let's say? And when I say, yes, it is, they go ahead and make the payment. Under the covers, more things may be happening and probably should be happening. So for instance, one of the things we'll be talking about this, I think, tomorrow, that is very important from the point of view of compliance is to get information from the beneficiary about their customer. Now, that's relatively easy for us because we have an agreement of terms phase where the beneficiary sends back information that says the person I'm going to pay is Sam. And it gives that information in a form that can be used by a regulator or by a law enforcement agency of one kind or another to come back to the FI and said, how come you tried to pay Sam when he is a notorious terrorist masquerading as a mild-mannered Mojaloop employee? Now, that's fundamentally important. And particularly when you're doing cross-border payments, you have to have some way of doing that. So there's automation, or can be automation, underneath the covers that says it may be that the DFSP systems are not giving their customers more than 2 intervention points, but that doesn't mean that the system isn't also doing things to enrich the data and enrich the reliability of its experience. So that will be a way of starting with that. At least that's the way in which we have done it, because we do face the same problem. That's not to say, pardon me, that's not to say that there won't be ways of saying, I mean, and there should be ways of saying, when I start to look at something like the question, what should the taxonomy of a payment be? Then one way of responding to that would be to say, why does it need to be more complicated than just saying, here's the person I want to pay, let me pay them? Now, we have an answer to that, and we're going to be talking about it tomorrow. But that doesn't mean that that's of course it means it's the right answer with tariffs. But you never know. It might be that even we, geniuses though we are, have not quite got the right answer to every question. But that's the point of having this discussion about the taxonomy of a payment. It must be the case that we can either say, no, these are different kinds of payments and therefore we shouldn't be treating them in the same way. Or we should be saying, actually, these are the same kinds of payments and we need to be treating them in the same way. And that should be the simplest possible way. Does that answer your question? Does it answer your question satisfactorily?
Well, I think it does answer the question. And the whole point of this is to see different perspective on how different regions are doing it. So maybe, it's good to me at least to see outside of Asia that the risk assessment is the big part of the consideration.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, this is a good input. Thank you for that. Thank you for your answer.
Okay. Anyone? Sorry. Julie.
Thank you. I have a request and a question. The first request is on the market practice document. You mentioned that we are opening it for review now. I think it would be actually nice, like if we have hub operators reviewing this market practice document. So could you please, thank you. And Vice, I'm hoping you're nodding as well to review the market practice document. So that's my first point. Second point is when I see ISO 222 for Africa, it raises a few questions in my head. First one is, I think we're a global citizen now. So why focus on the specific region where where effectively, like now, if we look at most of the projects, the scope is global. And if we look at even Mojaloop adoption, that's true that most of our adoption are in Africa, but we have some in Asia as well. And also it raises a third question around there is, when it comes to instant payment, IP Plus as a forum to discuss standards. So I appreciate that here when I look at what the flow of message, as part of IIPS, we have more, but could you perhaps partner on some of the messages that will, like, be used by both and an instant payment and an inclusive instant payment? Yeah, that's my question. Why Africa only? And two, perhaps could we consider an approach where we leverage IP plus?
Well, I stand before you embarrassed. I have to confess that the reason we started talking about IIPS, ISO 20022 for Africa, is because I happen to be having a drink with Robert Ochola, who is the CEO of African Enda. Now, obviously, an initiative like this can't be undertaken by a foundation like ours. We exist to do Mojaloop systems. And although there will come a time when all systems in the world will be Mojaloop systems, that time is not yet. And therefore, we have to be talking in a forum in which non-Mojaloop systems have as important a voice as Mojaloop systems. So we can't do it. So I needed some third-party institution. And because I happened to be having a drink with Robert at the time, I said to Robert, would you be interested in this? And he said, yeah. So as usual, as usual, it was my normal slapdash way of approaching these things usually. And if I had been wise enough to take Julie's advice, I would have got myself a properly global sponsor before I even appeared before you. And that's why I'm embarrassed. Does that answer your question, Julie?
Thank you. I think you're a bit harsh with yourself, but it does. Thank you.
Yes. So thank you for your presentation. I made some points as you spoke about the challenges and then some remediation efforts in terms of discussion at the module level and what have you.
Mhm.
I head up the IT department at the Central Bank of Liberia. And it seems like we are chasing this, I think it's October or November deadline. And I just want to know from folks across the room and you, what are some of the tips and tricks that I can use to sort of get these digital financial services on board to see the urgency of also upgrading their messaging system? Because we've done it for Swift, right? And we, looking at doing it for our payment systems. But the whole ecosystem has to be on board to really, get the benefit of it all, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm struggling to really convince these financial institutions to see the value in upgrading their messaging system. So if there's any tips or tricks that I can use maybe in my conversations to convince them, to just make the whole ecosystem healthy.
Sure.
Thank you.
I suppose my answer in the first instance is, this goes back to the question of how existing DFSPs connect to an instant payment system. Now, we have tools which basically say, here's how to connect a core banking system to a Mojaloop system. Now, those tools, we have different versions of them. Obviously, we have a different version for each core banking system. We've got a library of them for standard core banking systems, but we're constantly adding to it because we're constantly coming across new kinds of core banking systems. But we also have something that says, here is the ISO 20022 version of a Mojaloop system. And therefore, connecting to a Mojaloop system means that that DFSP is now using ISO 20022 messaging. Effectively, it means that they can, effectively the preliminary work, the analysis of how to construct a payment message out of a core banking system, payment execution message, is already done. And as long as they have a core banking system of, let's say, Temenos or might be, they can simply connect their core banking system to a Mojaloop system job done. And they are constructing messages which are ISO 20022 messages. And insofar as those payment schemes are connected with each other, they are opening themselves to a wider world of general availability of international payments using ISO 20022. Now, I got to admit, there's a few cards up my sleeve there, a few assumptions that how much Mojaloopiness there will be. But that's how we would say, if you want to go ISO 20022 in an ISO 20022 payment system, and that payment system is Mojaloop, then it's going to be quick and simple for you to do that in most cases. I mean, generally speaking, we can connect a DFSP in approximately a fortnight. If they have that. Does that answer your question? Or
Yes, thank you.
any other questions?
Sorry, can I just add like a few
Yes.
answer to your question as well, right? Because as Michael mentioned, we've been talking about ISO 20022 for quite some time, and convincing all the parties in the chain is actually quite tough to migrate to native ISO, right? So one thing we've been looking at indeed is, I think you have two things. One is, how do you reduce the cost, which Michael just explained, and the solutions that we have is like allowing any core banking system, like, to easily be in the position where they can produce ISO 20022. And the second aspect of it is business incentive. What can you get out of the migration, right? So this, I think part of it depends on what jurisdiction you are, which are the use cases you're looking at. But I would encourage you to come to the session tomorrow on Project Keystones, which should give some insight on what are some of the business value when it comes to applying data analytics and moving to ISO. And to your point as well around recommendation, I think training is a key factor, and making sure that the communication is not breaking down across the line. Because what you see is often like a market will publish their standard, but not everybody has access to the standard. Not all type of DFSP can go to my Swift standard and have access to the closed user group to access this, right? So that's why as being a relay and creating a clear communication strategy and forum overall is quite key. Otherwise, you risk into the risk of leaving behind some of the DFSP who won't know what to do, how to do their migration, what the new standard means, and so on.
Thanks for making that point. And I think most of them are relying on these middleware to correct them and buy them some time. And for me, the more middlewares you have, the larger your threat landscape. I don't like them. So let's cut them down, let's upgrade. But, I can do so much, but, just rely on their leaders to push from a private perspective. But, we're working hard, and thank you so much for your tidbits, and we'll continue to push. Thank you.
So we only have half an hour, I fear, before our attendance is required at the reception. So if nobody has any more questions, it only remains for me to thank you very much for your attention, and to say that if you do have any questions, or if you want to talk about anything ISO 20022 related, or even Mojaloop related, or even related, I'll be around all week and very happy to have conversations. Thank you very much.